Hello, and welcome. My name is Dr. Christopher Gennari. This is Great Big History Podcast. This is our History 102 series for our History 102 classes, World Civilizations from 1500 to 2000. This is the start of Part 1. This is Episode 1 of Part 1 from 1500 to 1900. Our theme, who will win the world? Why? Because by the end of our Part 1, someone will win the world. And so we're going to talk about different civilizations and their advantages, their disadvantages, their abilities to win the world, the ingredients that they had, and why, or more likely, why not, they don't win the world. They do or they don't. And so the idea is some of these civilizations don't know they're competing. Some of them don't know that they should have won the world or could have won the world. Some of them didn't even know there was a world to win. But by 1900, there will be a clear winner. That is going to affect our Part 2 and then affect our Part 3. So, the world of competition, 1500 to 2000. Now, we're going to start a little bit before that, because we need to introduce to get us to what's going on in 1500 that's going to set up the world where someone's going to win it. So, we start in the east. The Mongols, Persia, Tamerlane, China. Are any of them going to win the world? So we start with Song China. Song China is kind of a classical era. It's an era of economic vitality. There's the Silk Road going across Central Asia, from East Asia to Central Asia to the Middle East to Europe, going through Constantinople, going through Baghdad. So there's money being made. The Song have a navy. They have huge industries. They make more steel than all of Europe put together. So they got money, they got people, they got technology. They have education and inventions. Song China is the inheritor of science in the Middle Ages. With the destruction of the Roman world, with the trauma of the Arab attack on Constantinople in 717, science kind of ceases for a while in Europe. Historians will later call that the Dark Ages. And, of course, now there's a lot of argument that it was never really that dark. But what was happening was science disappeared. Rational thought is going to be replaced by religion for a while. And that high-end scientific thinking will go to the Arabs and to China, Song China. Tang and Song China. So you get print, you get gunpowder. This is going to be the big one, gunpowder. But the Song don't turn gunpowder into huge cannons and lots of weapons. It's not that they don't use them for weapons, but fireworks were more important because the Song really aren't at war because life is good. So gunpowder doesn't really work as a military device if you're not fighting anybody. They invent the compass. It is an optimistic and outgoing civilization. Problems? Song is mostly Han people, Han Chinese. It doesn't include the non-Han peoples of East Asia, like the Tang or the Han dynasties. So when we say Han, we mean East Asian Chinese people. The kind of people that if you're an American, you think of in your mind as Chinese when you go and get your Szechuan chicken at the takeout Chinese place. But China is a continent and has lots of non-Han people in it. Even today, the people of the West are Turks. They're Central Asian Turkish people. So you'd walk in and be like, wait, you're not Chinese. And they would say, of course I'm Chinese. Why are you being so racist? Because your image of what Chinese is Han, H-A-N. But that's not what all Chinese people are. But in the song, we have what I call small China. Now, small China is still big, but small China is mostly Han peoples. There's small China and big China. And so Tang and Han China are big China. They incorporate lots of non-Han Chinese people into it. While the Song and the Ming will be small China. They will mostly be East Asian Han Chinese people. So one of the problems is that it's very homogeneous. It's not very diverse. It's not reaching out into Central Asia, into Northeast Asia. It's not bringing in the people who, the lots of different cultures that surround the eastern edge of Asia, of China. Two is it had no control of the horse peoples, the nomadic horse peoples on their borders. None. The Turks, the Mongols, the Manchus, none. Beyond the wall, which is not yet the Great Wall as you'll know it, but they will build a couple walls and forts and such. Beyond that is the wild, nomadic horse country. There's the Silk Road that still goes west across Central Asia, and there's rest stop, but between those rest stops is essentially frontier, nomadic horse peoples. So what does this mean? It means the Song, while at peace domestically, have a problem on their borders. The problem that China always has on their border. Nomadic horse peoples who, if they ever get organized and need food, will invade northern China, western and northern China. And this is an ongoing, if you take my 101 class, it's over and over and over again. So what is the result? Well, the result is Song China actually breaks apart. It's invaded by a northern nomadic tribe that called the Yurkins. Then it will be invaded by the Mongols, and Song China will be absorbed into a larger empire. It is not going to rule the world. In fact, the Song China is the first China. Let me see. Well, you can make an argument for Tang China, but Song China definitely is a China that is absorbed by somebody else. Usually China absorbs others. China might get conquered, but it becomes the hub of that new empire, not for the Yurkins and the Mongols. It's a piece of their larger empire. Now, I know if you know what's happening, you'll be like, well, what about Yuan China and Kublai Khan? We'll get there. But for at least 2 generations, Song China is basically part of a larger Mongolian empire. So that brings us to the Mongols. All right. So let's talk about the Mongols. Well, in 1206, it starts with a guy, Genghis Khan, Temujin, who begins uniting Mongolian and Turkish tribes northwest of China, of Han China. And what they will then do is set out to create the largest land empire the world, continuous land empire the world will know. It will stretch from Korea to the middle of Anatolia, almost to Egypt. It will stretch into Europe, Poland, conquer all of Russia, or what will become Russia, the Ukraine, Kiev, Moscow. In 2 generations, Genghis Khan, and then under his son, it will stretch some 6,000 plus miles. Now, why? How did this happen? The Mongols are the last of the great nomadic horse conquerors. How did this happen? Well, they are the largest land empire ever. They connect China and Korea to the Europe and Middle East. This is the first time all of this has been connected. And it's done by a charismatic leader, Temujin, known in the West as Genghis Khan. The force that will power this is a powerful army, is a well-disciplined horse people army. And this is the last of, well, you can make the argument for Tamerlane as the last. But I don't think Tamerlane's empire really survives Tamerlane very long. And so what you get, I just don't know enough, I have to admit. But what we're talking, but even Tamerlane's making an argument that he's really a grandson of Genghis Khan, great-grandson of Genghis Khan. And so this is the last of the nomadic destroyer conquerors. They are horse archers, men on horses who are well-disciplined. The Mongolian general has the ability to command troops that no other general, especially in Europe, had. Just none. In a European army, you show up, and if you've ever seen Braveheart, you know how this works. They all line up on their horses, and the king says, "Charge!" And from that point on, every fighter is doing their own thing. They're all individuals. Not the Mongols. The Mongols were a modern army. The general could sit back and, using flags, could direct troops, could fill holes, stop attacks, could circle, destroy. A Mongolian general had the ability to command on the battlefield a way Napoleon could 500 years later, 600 years later. The Mongols are also willing to hire locals. They're hiring engineers. They know what skills they don't have. And the skill they don't have is how to break down the walls of cities. Why? Well, they're nomads. They don't live in cities. They don't build walls. They live in tents. And they ride horses. And horses can't climb walls. So they need people to be able to knock down walls. Well, that's a big deal, because you have to admit, first you have to admit you're not all that great, that you're missing something. Second, you have to promise them lots of money, because the people you're going to hire are going to be the people of the same civilization you're hiring them to destroy. So you're hiring Chinese to destroy China. You could find people to do it, but you're going to have to pay them. You can't do that on the cheap. They're willing to hire engineers. They know what they're lacking. And they're willing to say, I know it. Let's change. Let's bring in people. And we're going to see this over and over and over again, that lots of civilizations will not change. When forced between change their civilization or keep going and lose, we'll see keep going and lose happens a lot rather than change. People don't like changing. If it worked in the past, they like to keep doing it. The Mongols were willing to change. The other thing they were willing to do is terrorism. State terrorism. Conquer nomads, obliterate cities, scare civilizations into submission. They might murder 1 million people in a city, leave a few people alive, give them horses, say go to the next town and tell the people what we did. And so the stories of Mongolian destruction, on par with the worst of any conquerors anywhere. 1 million people, heads cut off, giant pyramids put outside of cities. Kiev left as a ruined husk for 50 years. That 50 years later, people traveling through Kiev are going to find this ruined city. It's still burned down. And the idea was, the Mongols said, if you fix it, we're going to come back and do bad things to you. And so people were so scared, they didn't. And so part of the goal was to scare civilizations into submission. Samarkand, Herat, these cities along the Silk Road that had been rich, that had connected the Muslim world to the Chinese world, are obliterated. They're just sacked. They're burned. Their people murdered. And that is going to have a profound effect on international trade. In fact, it's going to be why we get Columbus. So what is the toll of the Mongolian conquests? Well, 30 million Chinese are going to be dead. And they're going to suffer 100 years of servitude, which is a humiliation for China. That they're going to be owned by the Mongols for 100 years is a humiliation. Kiev is left a shell. This is a trauma that's never recovered from. In fact, Kiev is the leading city of the Slavic peoples. It will be replaced by Moscow because the Mongols will obliterate Kiev. And still, today, we are part of this fight. The President of the United States in 2020 was impeached in part because he took part in the fight between Moscow and Kiev. That goes back to the 1200s. That goes back to the Mongolian destruction of Kiev. That the idea was Ukraine was the natural leader of the Slavs, and with the Mongolian destruction, it allowed the rise of Moscow. And Moscow has dominated the Russians, and then the Ukrainians, the forests of Siberia. That Moscow will be the great winner. But this competition that goes back to the 1200s is still literally being part of our politics today. Baghdad, the greatest city of the Islamic world, is left a shell, just like Kiev. It is a trauma, and the Arabs don't recover from it. The Arabs are Allah's chosen people, and they won't be free for the next 600 years. The Mongols will own them, then the Turks, then the Europeans. It's not till the 1950s and oil that you start to get an independent Arabia, or Arab world, I should say. North African world again. And part of the violence of the terrorism, of Islamic terror, is the fallout from this destruction of Baghdad. ISIS wants to go back to this time period, to the time period before Baghdad was sacked by the Mongols, when Islam was literate, advanced, and rich. They want to make Islam, 1250 again, maybe 750 again. But certainly not post 1258. Iran is wrecked. India is looted. The stories of what Tamerlane will do in India. Delhi, right? The capital of India is New Delhi. Why is it New Delhi? Well, because Tamerlane destroyed Old Delhi. Just leveled the city. The story is he needed 900 elephants to cart off all the wealth from northern India. He just leveled the Indus River Valley civilizations, leveled the Ganges River kingdoms, and just looted whatever was in northern India. The Silk Road cities are torn up so that no infrastructure remains. The Silk Road cities were all rest stops for you to bring your goods one stop along the way from China to the Middle East to Europe. If they don't exist, if the storage doesn't exist, if the hotels don't exist, if the restaurants don't exist, if there's no place for merchants to stop, they stop coming. And the Silk Road gets torn up and ceases to function as a trade highway. But the Mongols, while they look like they could rule the world, don't. Why? Well, first, no matter where they go, they're foreign conquerors, and nobody likes them. They have no education because they're nomads. They don't have any schools. They don't have any literacy. They have horse stories. They don't have even settled gods. How are you going to compete with Buddhism, Confucianism, Islam, Christianity? These well-established religions and philosophies. How? You can't. Not if you don't have anything. Not if you have, the spirits of the forest. It's not sophisticated enough for the people you're conquering. So the people you're conquering also can't become Mongolian. You don't want them. Like the Mongols can absorb other nomadic horse peoples like the Turks, maybe the Yurkin, right? Because they're cousins. But the Chinese? No, they conquered the Chinese. They don't want them. They conquered the Arabs. They conquered the Russians. They're not the Russians don't want to become Mongolian, and the Mongolians don't want them to become Mongolian. So there's no way of taking this empire and using the population as anything but slaves. And so what happens is there's not that many Mongolians. 100,000, maybe? 2? I don't know. There's no census. So let's say it's 100,000. Islam is going to have 10 million people. Russia, 10 million people. China, 100 million people. Europe, another 100 million people, maybe, if you take it all together. Egypt, 10 million people. Maybe, probably more. So, the nomads, these nomadic horse peoples, there's not enough of them to conquer and run the world. And what happens is because they are impressed by the settled civilizations they conquer, they become the civilization that they conquered. So we're going to see the Yuan dynasty, the Mongolian dynasty in China, become Chinese. We see it in the art. We see it in what they eat. In the Middle East, they become Muslims. They do not become Christians, which is interesting. But they do become Muslims in the Russian world. And so they're linked to the Turkish peoples of Anatolia, of the Asia Minor. But they get absorbed by larger civilizations. So the Mongolian people in these far-off places cease to really be Mongolian after a generation, 2, 3. By 100 years, they don't look Mongolian anymore because they've married in. They have local wives. They don't speak Mongolian anymore because you're now 4 generations later. You haven't. The great-grandsons of Temujin have never seen Mongolia. All they know is the forests of Russia. So they'll speak the local Turkish dialect of the local Turkish tribes that are on the steppe, on the Russian steppe. And because they murdered so many people when they came through the first time, they're disliked by the people they are ruling. Which means whenever people get a chance to overthrow them, they'll take it. Whether it's going to be the Ming or the Russians, the Alexander Nevsky in Russia, in Moscow, they're going to overthrow these people when they get the chance. The other aspect is succession. The nomads by definition, if you took my 101 course, you know this, have an unruly system of government. They don't have a system. It's based on personality. It's based on charisma. It's who can take over. If you've ever watched Game of Thrones, you know this. When Khal Drogo dies, the Khalasar breaks up. He's got brothers who take some guys with him. He's got a cousin who takes them. Khaleesi is left with nobody. Old people and Westerosi. You know, why? Because she's a Westerosi woman. No one's going to follow her. Except those who nobody else wants. And the fellow Westerosi. And so, every time a great Khan dies, there's a problem. Who will come next? Now, the sons of Genghis Khan agree. They avoid civil war. So, it goes to Obadiah, the third son, the youngest son. The oldest 2 sons didn't like each other. They were going to, if one took over, they were going to have a war. And so they said, oh, well, what about the third son? And they both agreed. And what they got out of that was basically one got to conquer the Middle East, one got to conquer Russia, and they got independence. And that's great. And why? Well, the sons know each other. They grew up. They grew up with Temujin. They grew up with Genghis Khan. They grew up with him teaching them about loyalty and sons and, you have to work together. But the grandsons are growing up in Central Asia, in Eastern China, in the Islamic world, in Russia. They don't know each other. They haven't hung out. If they remember Genghis Khan at all, he was an old man by the time they come along. And so the grandsons are perfectly willing. They don't have those connections to each other. And so they are perfectly willing to fight each other. In a way the sons of Genghis Khan weren't, the grandsons are. And so you get a series of civil wars. And you get the breakup of this giant Mongolian empire. Genghis Khan and his son Obadai's empire into 4 pieces. And if you're on the video, this is the 4 pieces. You get this Russian piece, you get the Arab world, Arab and Persia piece, you get a Central Asian, Turkish piece, and then you've got the kind of China, Eastern Silk Road, Han, Korea, Tibet, and the local peoples who have a long history of interacting with China. You break into those 4 parts. And Mongolia, by the way. That's also Mongolia. And you have those, and it breaks into these 4 parts. And those 4 parts are going to spend the next 100 years fighting each other. And what that means is economic destruction. Because the borders don't change all that much. It breaks up, and now it means trade is attacked. Cities are attacked. And so the Silk Road, which is starting to make a recovery, is ripped up again. And into this comes Tamerlane, who's just going to level. He's like the nuclear blast. He just levels stuff. And so what that means is trade must go around to China by sea. The 1,000 years of the Silk Road, which went from Eastern Asia across Central Asia to the Arab Middle East to Europe, is done. It's ripped up. The cities are obliterated. The people are obliterated. There's simply no place for you to lay your head down. There's no inns. There's no hotels. There's no auction houses. There's no markets for you to buy and sell goods. The tourist industry of Central Asia and the Middle East is destroyed by the Mongols. So if you want to trade with China, you're going to have to go around by sea. And this is a profound change. In 200 years, Marco Polo goes from walking to China to Columbus never even considering walking to China, even though that's the way everybody did it for 1,000 years. By the time you get to Columbus, the idea of walking to China is a dead idea. Central Asia was poverty. The Middle East was poverty and closed off. The Arabs don't want people coming through the Middle East. That's because of the trauma of the Mongolian conquest. China's Islamic provinces that used to be rich along the Silk Road, poverty. And so we have the 2 maps. From 1271 to 1295, we have Marco Polo, who travels overland, over Central Asia to China. He's going to hang out in China for a while, about a decade, and then he's going to take this long sea route home. But he's always hugging the coast. He's going to go around what is today Vietnam, through Malaysia and Indonesia, to the Indian Ocean route to India. He's going to follow India to the Persian Gulf, boop, back onto the land-based Silk Road. By 1600, here's the map of the Dutch trade in 1600. It's completely by sea. It goes around Africa, around India, through the Straits of Malacca to China and Japan. It also goes to North America and South America, so that's new. But by 1600, Western China, Central Asia, the Middle East are no longer major trade routes. They have dried up. And with the end of the Silk Road comes poverty for all the people who used to be rich along the Silk Road. Now, in our next episode, we're going to talk about one of the successor states, Yuan, otherwise known as Mongol China. Thank you.